Hello and welcome to Warwick Words Digital History Festival. The recording of this In Conversation is on Zoom, being done remotely by Trevor in Warwick, myself in Cheltenham in Gloucestershire, and Annie is in East Anglia. Am I right?
Yes, yeah. Indeed, in Ely in Cambridgeshire.
Oh, lovely. The new technology which is enabling us to bring this to you is a steep learning curve for all of us. So if there are any hiccups like lip sync, not quite right, sorry, that's Zoom for you. I'm Neela Mann. I'm a director of Warwick Words, and with me today is Annie Gray, resident food historian on Radio 4's The Kitchen Cabinet, and she's appeared on television programmes talking about food through the ages. She was described by Lucy Worsley as the queen of food historians, and whilst we're talking about queens, Annie's also written The Greedy Queen, Eating with Victoria. Lovely. Now, Annie's latest book is, I do have it, Victory in the Kitchen. Here we are. I got one too. It's Victory in the Kitchen, the life of Churchill's cook. So welcome, Annie. Thank you so much for doing this. This is just such great fun. I think you've got the best job ever because you've got two of my favourite subjects. But what led you to become a culinary historian?
I suppose I sort of fell into it. I did history as an undergraduate and I loved the history, but I wasn't particularly fond of my degree. Went off, worked in marketing for a while, believe it or not, and I was absolutely terrible at having a job. I mean, really, really awful. I got sacked from everything. So I did a master's in historical archaeology to sort of get my head around what I really wanted to do and to rethink. And I absolutely loved archaeology. It's tangible, it's about material culture, it's what people touch, where they live, what they wear. And it really was, it was just absolutely thrilling. I knew I wanted to work with the public, so I knew I wanted a topic within history that would have the maximum sort of accessibility, I suppose. And as part of the masters, we made chocolate, or rather I made chocolate one day for one of the classes. We were researching the domestic sphere, so we were talking about tea and coffee and chocolate. My father worked at the time for Nestle, so I was able to get hold of cocoa liquor. So I went away and I made 17th century chocolate, brought it in, and we all drank it and got slightly high. And it was this extraordinary moment where we were all sort of high as a kite, really, on the sugar and the chocolate and just the chili and the general buzz of everything. And I thought, this is it. This is so fantastic. I love cooking. I love eating. I adore history. I want to do something tangible. Food is such a universal, and it's endlessly fascinating and has this enormous potential to tell us about ourselves. So I sort of started down that route at that point, really, and never looked back.
Yeah, that's great. Now, this book, as you say, remains above all else Georgina's story, Georgina Landemare, but also she became a vehicle to explore domestic service in the 20th century, especially working class women in the lives of famous people. As you say, they are rarely mentioned, but you wanted to put them back into history. So why do you think that was? Why did they not appear in the books, as you say?
I think it's very easy to forget about ordinary people, and that has been something that's been recognised within history for decades, but it's partly a function, I think, of the way publishing works, in all honesty, because you need to come up with a book that will sell. You need to justify your existence as an author. It's guaranteed that a book on Jane Austen will sell, a book on Charles Dickens will sell, a book on Winston Churchill will sell. It's much harder to write something about Josephine Jones, who lived in Cardiff and didn't do anything memorable or notable. So it's very, very difficult to pitch a book and to write about ordinary people, even though we are all ordinary people. So I think it's partly a function of that they tend to disappear because of the reality of publishing and the reality of the reading public. We publish a lot of books in Britain and people's tastes do tend towards what they know. And I think partly as well, and especially with figures such as Churchill, and the same was true of Queen Victoria when I wrote about her, there is a lot to say about their lives. They are perennially fascinating. People do look upon them as a reflection of their own times. With Churchill, there's a biography of Churchill about every decade. Sort of seems to be that we roll around like clockwork every 10 years, and each biography reflects the time in which it's written. Of course it does. But it does mean that everybody else doesn't really get a look in. Writing this book, I didn't want to write about Churchill. The starting point for the book was 20th century food, really. Just as with Queen Victoria, I wanted to write about 19th century food, and she was a good vehicle to do it. with this book, I really wanted to write about 20th century domestic service, an area which I think has been quite misunderstood. We tend to be very polarised in our views of domestic service. It's either scullery maids who are 14 with their knees bleeding, crying themselves to sleep every night, or it's the sort of Downton Abbey-esque, very cosy, everybody gets on really well, it's lovely effect. And of course, reality was that it employed so many people, in particular women, that it was both at the same time and everything in between. It would be like summing up office work today by saying, oh, everybody hated their jobs, or oh, everybody was really, really happy. So I got into it because I wanted to write about 20th century food and 20th century service. And then I discovered Georgina, almost by mistake. And Georgina's story, of course, being linked to Churchill meant that I knew it was going to be a story with a hook that people would be interested in. And it sort of all came together from that point of view. I was lucky enough to meet her granddaughter, Georgina's granddaughter, who has a limited family archive and was incredibly helpful and very encouraging. So it was a book that didn't quite write itself, but it was certainly a story that the more I investigated, the more I realised it was a very, very important story to tell, until by the end I wanted to write about Georgina as much as any of the other elements, because she was such a tremendous figure to investigate.
Yeah, it is an interesting story, because it would appear that she already had a career path in mind. I mean, she was born in 1882 near Tring, and as Georgina Young, lived in the countryside, went off to London with her family at a young age, so she'd had both sides of it. But her grandfather was a gamekeeper. How much of an influence was the early life that she spent, because she went back and forwards holidays and things to her grandparents, how much of an influence was the rural life that she had?
I think it was quite a big influence. I mean, she never left London really once she'd started on what she called her track of life. She did work outside London in various country houses and various other places, but she was very much a London-based person. But I think what that early rural upbringing gave her, and certainly what she looked back on it as having given her, was a set of values that were very much the values of the rural working class. So thrift and practicality and honesty, and some of those values as well, which she became quite reactionary in her old age. She wrote a memoir which she tore up and put down the sink, most of it. So the sort of fragmentary pages that exist, you have to take with a pinch of salt, because she's looking back on a very long life and she's trying to make a deliberate point. But what she is consciously saying is, you know, in those days, it's not so much that they knew their place, but there was a hierarchy of being and a way of networking within rural villages, which she bought into and believed was a good way of being. So, for example, she almost certainly got her first job through both the servants' network, but also possibly through the connections that her family had. There were 2 or 3 key figures in Oldbury, which was the village where her grandmother lived, who pretty much provided employment for everybody in that village. If not directly, then because they knew a friend who was looking for a gardener or a coachman or whatever it was. So those networks, that idea of getting employment through somebody higher up the social status, higher up social hierarchy than you, they were really important. And I think she respected that and respected this quite entrenched class system in a way that by the time she was writing her memoir in the 70s, we would already have found somewhat alien.
Yeah. In 1909, at the age of 27, Georgina married a 52-year-old widower with 5 children called Landemare. He came from a family of pâtissiers with a shop in Paris, and had become head chef at the Ritz, the most prestigious of the London.
He was never head chef at the Ritz.
Was he not head chef? He worked at the Ritz, did he? Became chef.
Probably not.
Okay, tell us what he was.
That's what the family legend says, but there's no evidence to suggest he worked at the Ritz. He certainly worked at hotels, but yes, probably not the Ritz.
Yeah.
He was cooked to Duke of Newcastle, though, so very, very prestigious. I mean, you know, really very good.
Paul introduced her to food cooked by Escoffier and the French classics, and you called him an elusive man, but he clearly had a great influence on her and her cooking.
Yes, he did. He's elusive because the further back in history you go, obviously the more difficult it is to find people, and he's French, so a lot of the records in Paris were burnt in the Tuileries fire as part of the Commune of Paris. So there's patchy records. You can see where he lived, and you can see where he worked to some extent through the various official records that survive, but to get an idea of his character is much harder. With Georgina, her granddaughter knew her extremely well, but never met Paul because he died well before Georgina's grandchildren were born. So there's no living memory of Paul at all. But he was clearly very, very talented. You know, he was a cook to the aristocracy. He worked in hotels. He was among the leading set of chefs. And French chefs at that point were so desired. Anyone wanted a French chef. Any restaurant worth its salt wanted to employ a French chef. French cuisine, I mean, even the word, you know, that's what we aspired to at that point. And you still see it today. If you go to a high-end restaurant, the chances are the menu may well be written in French. So it's still something that we regard as a particular type of food that has a particular cachet today. And I think what Paul gave Georgina was a solid grounding in that style of food, and also a confidence in cooking it. She was clearly good enough to do well before. I mean, she'd made cook when she was in her 20s. She was in charge of quite large households, so she had staff under her. She wasn't just a sort of cook general, as the term was, where you would go in and you would cook and there'd be nobody else in the household. She was working in big houses. She was a career chef. But to work alongside someone who had already had a very long and very illustrious career, to train alongside him, and they worked together as a unit, as jobbing chefs, caterers. So she would have sort of almost taken a step back. Instead of being in charge of her own kitchen, she's now sous chefing for Paul. But she said herself later in life that he gave her the keys to this kingdom, effectively. And he would have unlocked for her, again, that sort of chef's network. So she would have been able to talk food and learn food from Paul's connections. Lots and lots of other French chefs, be they in Paris, in London, wherever they were. So I think you know, working with Paul was absolutely crucial to the future development of her career.
So at the time that she was married, was she then working as a freelance with Paul?
She did after her marriage, yes. So working, there's a whole kind of idea that women always just gave up work on marriage. And that was true for some people, it was certainly the aspiration, but it certainly wasn't true for most of the working class. And I think Georgina as well has such a sort of determination to work. It would have been inconceivable for her to have just been a housewife. Paul had a reasonable amount of money. He was earning probably around £150 a year as a chef. They had one child at this point. Another one had died, sadly, very, very young. But there was no real reason for her to stay at home. So they formed a team and they went out and worked as caterers together. And that's a particular period of their lives where it's really difficult to find out where they worked, who they worked for. There are hints in later writings of Georgina's, but nothing absolutely definite. But there's this amazing, tantalizing picture of them together in a kitchen, and it's clearly a 19th century kitchen, probably in an 18th century or even earlier building. They're at this sort of classically Edwardian table. Their outfits are all 1920s. There's Paul, there's Georgina, there's another young man and another young woman. They seem to be a team. But you know, why was the photograph taken? They were presumably catering some big event, and this was a photographer memorializing whatever it was. But the photograph no longer exists because unfortunately it was sent off, I think, to the Times and never came back. So there's a photocopy of it and that's it. And you can, I mean, I've peered at this thing with a magnifying glass and it's like, where is it? What is it? What are they doing? It tells you so much and yet not quite enough. So it's clear they were working together. It's clear they were working at a very high level. And Paul seems to have continued working right up until his death in 1932, because he always put down on every official document that he was a chef. He was never chef retired. It was always a chef.
And they went to Paris and they went to New York, but that was only holiday, was it not? They didn't go there to.
He went to New York to go and visit his family. She stayed behind and just captured photographs. He seems to have had a whale of a time. This was years before his death. And he went off and he visited all the sites and sort of came back just on the eve of the Wall Street crash. And there's these amazing photographs of him visiting Coney Island and dressing up and hanging out with his son. Most of his children from his first marriage emigrated. They nearly all ended up in around New York, really. And yes, they went to Paris because they went to go and visit his relatives. So he had quite extensive relatives in Paris, and I mean, you know, they lived very much a life that we would recognise. They did go on holiday, but they also worked very, very hard. And the photograph albums are lovely to look through, all captioned in Georgina's very flowing handwriting, with this sort of level of tongue-in-cheek affection that is just lovely to see, quite frankly.
The First World War it changed domestic service quite dramatically, did it not? They say life in the trenches blurred the class divisions, but the home front for the domestics, the female domestic staff, changed considerably as well. Not only did women have the freedom with the opportunity of the roles they could then take on, taking on after the men, which was inconceivable before the war, but also life in country houses changed. How did this affect Paul and Georgina's work? Because, of course, Paul was way past the age of being in the army.
Yes, his sons joined up, as did Georgina's brothers, but Paul was extremely beyond conscription. Their work dried up, and most of the country houses in the First World War were converted either into convalescent homes or into training bases, as again they would be in the Second World War. And there were a lot of food shortages as well. Rationing didn't come in until 1918. So what you saw a lot was a very, very inequitable system of food distribution, where the rich could almost get whatever they wanted to and the poor suffered. But you also, for the first time in history, saw a sort of evening out of living standards. So for the very first time, everybody had a wage, because if you were a conscripted soldier, you were waged, you had a salary for doing it. If you were a woman behind in Britain, you stepped into the role that a man might have occupied previously. So for the first time in history, everybody had a job. And for the first time in history, that meant that people could afford to eat. So people were used to being able to eat. And overall, it was quite if you lay aside the hideous death, destruction and mayhem, it was a reasonable time in terms of living standards. But from Paul and Georgina's point of view, it would have been a real shocker to the system, because they had to get used to cooking with obviously a much reduced range of food. Food queues were a fact of life. There were riots in various parts of Britain when the food ran out, is one of the reasons that eventually rationing was brought in, because actually it was felt quite rightly that if you are asking men to go and fight, you had to do the basic thing of providing for their families. Otherwise, what motivation did they have to fight in the first place? So the First World War was a very strange time in terms of governmental policy really being made up on the hoof, and then that becoming something that was then built on in the Second World War.
I've got a quote here for you that is about domestic staff in Cheltenham. Well, of course, a place like Cheltenham could afford its domestic staff. There's a couple of things. One of them I thought was interesting was they said that it was the patriotic duty of the woman in the house, and this is a Cheltenham paper for the upper classes. It was the duty of the woman of the house not to be disloyal and selfish in employing superfluous servants, and it was a crime against the community to retain women servants who could be dispensed with. Still, you have that attitude, do you not?
Yeah.
There's something that can be easily got rid of. And then on the other side of it, because we had a big munitions factory near here employing 7,000 people, you've got a quote from a munitions worker who had previously been in domestic service about how she was treated. The indignities of never being thanked or addressed or acknowledged at all, and the mistresses who prefer food to be thrown away rather than let their servants have it. Working in the munitions factory was like being let out of a cage.
Yeah.
I think that just speaks volumes about the way that the domestic staff were treated at that time.
It was the biggest impact of the war. It by the 1930s, it hadn't impacted actually on the number of people that were employed. By the 30s, domestic service was once again the biggest employer of women. What it did was it changed the mental attitude towards service. Fewer and fewer people, in particular women, wanted to live in. More and more jobs that would have been done by men, footmen, valets, butlers, those kind of jobs, cooks, they were more and more likely to be women, but the women themselves saw this increasingly as an imposition and wanted to have rights, to be able to live out, to be able to have lives. So although domestic service didn't decline, some country houses obviously did suffer, but others were built, newly rebuilt. Mental attitudes towards it really changed. And I think that was one of the reasons that Georgina, after the war, went fully freelance. After Paul's death in 1932, she became a cook for hire. It didn't seem to have occurred to her to have gone back into live-in service as she had done before her marriage. She could earn more as well as a jobbing cook because she could charge per event rather than having a fixed salary. And it gave her the freedom to bring her daughter up and to keep a fixed address as well, which of course was a huge thing for many servants, because when they lived in, yes, they could save, but they didn't have their own address if something happened to them.
20s and 30s must have been a really exciting time, and I think it's the time that you really like as well, isn't it? So how did food tastes change in the 20s and 30s?
They pared down. I have a soft spot for Edwardian food just because it's so utterly bonkers. I mean, in some ways it is the most stupid period of British cuisine ever. We got to a point, and it's very easy in hindsight especially to say, well, food got too stupid, there was always going to be a crash coming. We got to a point where everything had to be moulded and primped and preened, and especially if you were nouveau riche, you couldn't have something on the table that looked like what it used to when it was in a field. And after the war, you didn't get so many 27-course meals. It was more likely to be 9 or even 6 for most people. There was a new emphasis on seasonality, which you hadn't seen previously. Previously, if you were rich enough, you wanted to eat against the seasons. But in the 20s and 30s, with so many country houses suffering, a lot of the kitchen gardens were converted into market gardens. So actually, and you got a lot more imports from California and tinning and that kind of thing. So now everyone could get a pineapple. So why would you want a pineapple if you're rich? Now you want a perfect tomato when it's actually in season, because that's now harder to get hold of than a peach in December. So you see this kind of switch around, much more emphasis on seasonality, on fresh ingredients, and also on global flavors. There's a kind of vogue for exploring the world through food, a kind of idea that actually we've been through this cataclysmic war. Let's cook the food from Germany, let's cook the food from Austria or Italy or even China, and actually start to realize that we're connected, and that connectivity should save us from another all-encompassing war. But there's still a really, really brilliant strand of totally weird, bonkers cuisine, especially when it comes to salads, where you get a lot of American influence, which is not always great. And you also get some very, very strange French influenced salads. There's a lot of artistry involved, and I mean, some of them are just awful. And I mean, I cooked, obviously, when I was researching the book, I cooked my way through all of the decades I was writing about.
Yeah.
Which, and then I had to go on a diet, because the 30s, there's a lot of puddings, which was great, but it's probably greater if you are a domestic servant and burning 5,000 calories a day than if you are a writer sitting at your desk, not scrubbing floors. And I mean, the food is fantastic in that era. Some of the cooking, some of the dishes developed into really traditional British classics. So this is kind of the era of your steamed puddings and your sponge cakes and your treacle tarts and that kind of thing. And they're absolutely fantastic. But if you want to be really stupid, then go and make yourself a crab salad with mayonnaise and avocado and cherries in, and just, feel your brain dribble out of your ears. It is fantastic.
So Annie, we'll now go on to the time when Georgina Landemare was working for Churchill. She'd been widowed in 1932 and left with a 17-year-old daughter, Yvonne, but she'd had worked for the Churchills on a freelance basis, had she not, before the war?
She'd met them before the war, so she cooked for people like the Hamiltons, who were very, very good friends with the Churchills, and had certainly cooked for them. She may also have worked for them with Paul. The first documented instance of her working for them is in 1933, where she went to go and cook for them at Chartwell, which was their new, exciting country house. The Churchills were quite rackety. I think it's fair to say that they always, especially Winston, spent rather a lot more than he had. He was the kind of man where he'd get a book advance, or he'd be promised a book advance, and he'd have spent it 5 times before the person who was giving him the advance then went, actually, we've changed our minds. So they never had any money. And the staff that they employed tended not to last very long. It's one of the curious things about their household, that they could not retain staff. They didn't treat them well, they didn't pay them well. Staff were brought in from agencies, right, left and centre. There are a few that last sort of, 3 or 4 months. There are a couple of others that seem to last a year or so, not very many. And the cooks that they had tended to be very untrained young girls. So if you think of something like Miss Marple, where her ladies' maids tend to be village girls who she trains up and then they, of course, immediately leave. That's exactly the thing Clementine Churchill had going on. So she would bring on these relatively untrained girls, train them up, because Clementine herself knew her way around a kitchen very well. And then, of course, as soon as they learnt to cook properly, they'd be off to go and work for someone that was a better employer. So what they did instead was they employed caterers or outside cooks to come in and cook for them at their particularly big and important occasions. And the 30s were a time when Churchill was in his wilderness years, so he was networking furiously but out of ministerial position. Chartwell was a real focus for him bringing together the kind of people that he wanted to meet, that he needed to have as part of his political and social network. So having really good food was key. So Georgina was one of many, it's got to be said, different jobbing cooks who came in to cook for them, but she must have been quite successful because she cooked them for several different weekends and also weeks to cover their normal cook, and they clearly liked her food a great deal because they kept on bringing her back as long as they could afford her.
Yeah, war was declared with Germany on the 1st of September 1939, and Winston Churchill became Prime Minister the following May. At the age of 57, Georgina offered her services to the Churchills at a drop in pay as part of what she considered to be her war work. Why do you think she did that?
I think she was very canny. She, having lived through the First World War and knowing that her work would drop off, she must have looked around and thought to herself, well, I'm nearing an age when others would retire, but I've got not a lot to retire to. She didn't get on very well with her daughter, who in any case now was an adult. So she must have thought, right, I need to be employed by someone full-time at this juncture, someone who will have a job for the duration of the war, and someone who will want to entertain for the duration of the war. Who can I think of? And Churchill would have stood out even at that point, because he'd been one of the few voices consistently speaking out against Hitler. His star was clearly finally in the ascendant. I mean, I think had it not been for war breaking out, Churchill may well have been written down in history as a sort of somewhat shrieky has-been. But of course, he wasn't. In fact, he became First Lord of the Admiralty, then Prime Minister, and was clearly going to be someone who had a job, unless he worked himself into an early grave. So from her point of view, she got on well enough with Clementine Churchill and with Winston Churchill to be able to think, I can cope with working for them. They were notoriously difficult as well, so I suspect she probably had a sort of, well, if I can put up with them, then very few can. Idea. So off she went, because better to have a drop in salary but have a guaranteed job for however long this war was going to last than to be able to earn more but actually not have access to that work. So I think what she decided to do was very, very wise, and Clementine Churchill said later that she accepted with enormous enthusiasm because she knew that Georgina was very, very capable and that she'd make the most of the ration as well, which of course was they knew was going to come in. It came in just before Georgina started work for them.
In the book you wrote, to Churchill, food was central, not only as a pleasure but as a diplomatic tool. In a time when the world was embroiled in war, Georgina was essential to Churchill's dinner table diplomacy. Can you tell us more?
He was someone, he loved food, but he was also very well aware of the usefulness of dinner parties and dinner giving. Competitive dinner party giving is sort of one of the most peculiarly British characteristics that really are around food. And Churchill was well aware that you bring people around a table, they eat something that's very good, they drink perhaps more than they are used to, their tongues loosen, you have a convivial gathering. And this sort of informal way of politicking was hugely important to him. There's the stuff that goes through Hansards and is formally said in the Houses of Parliament, and then there's all the networking that goes on behind the scenes. And simply put, people don't come back to dinner if the food is really bad. So he needed to create an atmosphere where people felt happy, where they wanted to come and visit him, and where they would think, oh, I've got an invitation to Mr. Churchill's. Well, actually, I think he's a bit of an old windbag, but I tell you what, his cook makes a really mean veal casserole. So I'm just going to go for the food. But then by the time you're there, of course, he will work his magic on you and you'll come out thinking, well, maybe he's got a point, actually. I think there's a good discussion that we had about whether or not we need to increase the amount of munitions that we're producing in the east of England, or whatever the discussion is. It's much easier to do it if you know the food is excellent. So it's one of those sort of unseen things. I mean, to give another example, Eleanor Roosevelt over at the White House was notorious for being a terrible hostess. And there are some theories that suggest that the reason she employed such a bad cook was deliberately to punish her husband for having an affair. And the Churchills and others who visited the White House during the war all said, God, the food was appalling. You know, they didn't want to go there, any excuse to leave. So, of course, it would have made for quite an awkward dinner party if you know that what you're having is awful. Excuse me.
Yeah, the story you say is told through one eager eater, i.e. Winston Churchill, and one skilled cook. Churchill was a gourmand, a legendary bon vivant, who liked to think that he had simple tastes, but in fact he was quite specific about what he liked and disliked. I particularly like the fact that he liked tinned mandarin oranges. Who eats those now? But what was Churchill like to cook for?
He was very demanding. I mean, I don't think he was as discerning as Clementine. Clementine was very discerning, and Clementine was more of a gourmet than a gourmand. So she liked very fine food, but not a great deal of it. Churchill was much more of a trencherman. But he's a curious one because he very carefully promoted his image as a man who liked plain and simple food. You know, it really kind of enforced his idea of Britishness, to be seen as somebody who ate the good roast beef of old England. And you see it today with politicians who will be seen in pubs drinking. It's always pubs drinking a pint, even if they don't drink or they only drink wine. They'll always be in a pub with a pint. It's this kind of, oh, well, they're British, aren't they? They're just like you and me. Well, no, they're not, because actually, you know, they were brought up in this huge house and they went to eat and then on to, they're not just like you and me. And Churchill was the same. You know, he's part of the aristocratic ruling class. Most of his meals involved caviar and cream and butter and all sorts of things. And even during rationing, you know, it wasn't something that really applied to him. So this idea of, oh yeah, but the Prime Minister likes roast beef just like I do, is so strong and something he very much promoted. It's very difficult to get an idea of actually what he really liked and disliked, although certainly he did genuinely like Irish stew and, as you say, tinned mandarin oranges and plover's eggs and peaches and honey. You know, so there are lots of things. When he talks about liking plain food, it has to be seen in the context of someone who doesn't always eat plain food.
Precisely. He liked to consider himself to be a man of the people, which he clearly could never be, as you say, the upbringing he had. I found some of my mother's papers from her radiation cookbook.
Oh, I've got a copy of that somewhere.
And that's an original, that one. Oh, yeah. And in it, I found making the most of the fat ration.
Oh, yes.
And it tells you that you can melt margarine and add it to an equal quantity of mashed potatoes.
Yes, well, you can.
Yeah, and if you want a decent sandwich filling, how about pilchards and finely shredded cabbage?
Why not?
Why not? Be nice?
If you can't get hold of bone marrow and nasturtiums, then why not?
So, but Churchill didn't really, although he thought he did, he didn't really understand what life was like under rationing, did he? He felt sadly short. But there's a lovely story, is there not, about
yes, it's one of the few that Georgina used to tell. She was very cagey about stories about her time with Mr. Churchill, and this one she would talk of after a certain amount of sherry when she was in the old people's home. He apparently at one point wanted to know what the ration was, so she would bring him breakfast every day. So she brought up the ration all laid out on a tray and showed it to him, and he said, "Wow, that's not too bad for a day." She said, "For a week."
Yeah.
Apparently he was suitably crestfallen. And I think it is true. If you look at the ration as something for a day, today we would quite happily eat most of that in a day. And it is difficult to do that. There's I know I have tried once to stick to a rationing diet. The trouble for me as a person living in 2020 is I look at the ration and I think, well, I'm all right with the butter and I'm fine with the lard, but I don't want to touch the margarine because that's really bad for me. And I wouldn't actually eat that much sugar over the course of a week normally anyway. No. But the meat ration, well, that's very healthy, but actually I'm going to go off ration and I'm going to have some offal. And as soon as you start thinking like that, you start to realise that the ration, the point about the ration was that was what you were allocated, that was what you were guaranteed. I mean, you paid for it, obviously. But nobody adhered just to the ration because everybody tried to grow their own or barter with their neighbours or keep pigs or keep hens or whatever it was. You always had more than just that ration because you always found a way to have other foods. And whether you were living on rabbit or whether you were Churchill and you had the king sending you venison from Balmoral, it's sort of how long's a piece of string.
Yeah, and the king, by the way, he had lunch with Churchill every Tuesday, did he not? Because Because the rationing was so ghastly at Buckingham Palace.
Yes, well, they were practicing conspicuous austerity. The royal family really wanted to be seen to be doing the right thing. So apparently the food was absolutely awful. Whereas Churchill's view of the ration was that it could be supplemented by anything anybody sent him, which did tend to be Balmoral venison and trout from the Thames. And of course, he had his own kitchen garden down at Chartwell, and there was another garden at Chequers. So yes, the king, I think, quite enjoyed his Tuesday luncheons, which tended to be rather more grandiose than they might have been otherwise.
Georgina, though, had to feed all members of the family and all the staff at different times. That must have been really quite hard for her. And Churchill had an acute inability, as you said, to live within his means, and Clemmy hated debt. So how did Georgina cope with the budget and all the different people that she had to feed? Was she in charge of the budget? Or
yes.
Did she?
Yeah. And she would have been well used to that, because of course that's part and parcel of the role of a cook. So before her marriage, when she was working in-house, she would have been organising all of the household budgets for food, and also again being in charge of looking after the servants. So an Edwardian household, such as Georgina would have cooked in before her marriage, you'd have had 3 different interest groups in the kind of household Georgina was cooking at. So the family, the upper servants and the lower servants, and each of those groups would have had 4 meals a day. The lower servants and the upper servants would have taken sort of breakfast and luncheon together, or breakfast and supper and tea together, but still there's a lot of people eating a lot of different meals. So I think to her it wouldn't have been anything unnatural or different to anything she was used to, but certainly trying to make the ration stretch to put on dinners that are good enough to serve the king while also retaining your household staff is quite a juggling act. And it's quite clear that, because the ration books would have been pooled, so she had all of the ration books for everybody in the household. She would have gone out and got all of the meat at once, all of the sugar, and it's quite clear that the servants didn't always get their full ration of whatever it was, because it was going upstairs. But at the same time, there was so much extra stuff coming in, they didn't eat badly. So there were lots of things like, I mean, we've got the menu books for the 50s when rationing was still in force, but the war was over. And there's lots of things like cremola puddings and blancmanges and rice puddings, lots of starchy puddings that would fill you up, would be very economical. Habitually, whatever is eaten for dinner on the family table is either reprocessed for the family luncheon, or it's turned into something for the servants. So it will quite often just say leftovers from the top table for the servants' luncheon. So she'll take the remains of a joint and she'll make it into a batter pudding, something like that, or make it into a curry. So she was very, very good at making sure there was absolutely no waste, and that every meal was planned so it flowed into each other as well.
But she also had a pretty long day. She used to say that she never went to bed until Churchill had had his last whiskey, and she was always up to do the breakfast in the morning. Winston chided her when the air raid siren went, did he not? I always have to be out after you. If Mr. Hitler gets you, I won't get my soup.
Yeah, which I think sums up his viewpoint, really.
Yeah, but on one occasion, Hitler did nearly get her. What happened?
This is during the Blitz in 1940, and at that point they were still resident in Downing Street. Later on they moved across to the Annex, which was opposite. The kitchen at Downing Street, which now is this piping pool, has this enormous plate glass window at one end, 20-foot plate glass window, and is a basement kitchen. So everything is happening with this window kind of giving the light, and there they were making dinner. And Georgina always said that she was cooking this mousseline pudding, which is in her manuscript cookery book, which survives. And it's an amazing, beautiful pudding. It's a kind of light lemon sponge, which is steamed. It's sort of almost somewhere between a souffle and a sponge cake. So she's cooking this thing, and in her own words, she couldn't have left it. She couldn't have left it. And the air raid sirens were going, but she's cooking this pudding. There's no way she's going to leave it. Had to be ready for the butler to take up at the point. And they'd all got used at this point to when the sirens went, just ignoring them. Everybody in London had. Sirens are wailing, planes are starting to get closer, and all of a sudden Mr. Churchill comes down from upstairs where they are dining and says, we do need to go to the shelter. We've got to get to the shelter. Downstairs, everybody. And she said, so all they go, off they go. She said every night he had to make her go down to the shelter, because every night she would be ignoring the sirens to cook. So they all go down, and then the all clear eventually sounds, and they come back upstairs again, and a bomb had fallen about 10 metres away from Downing Street. So it wasn't a direct hit, but this plate glass window had shattered absolutely everywhere, blown into the kitchen. She certainly would have died or been extremely badly injured had she been in the kitchen. And her thought was, well, isn't there a lot of mess? There's too much rubble on the table, and the pudding was ruined. So, but she said Churchill saved her life that night. And it's the only appearance that she made in his own memoirs of the war. He told this story suitably grandiosely, and in his view, he had a sort of godlike premonition and rushed everyone down, whereas her version is much, much more prosaic.
He was notorious for being difficult, wasn't he? You talked about the fact that they never kept servants for very long, and it was only herself and I think his valet, was it, that lasted so many years. But one of the other things that must have been really hard for her was that he kept changing the place and the times where he was going to have his meals. What did she end up doing? How did she cope with that?
Well, he was desperate to eat at Downing Street because it was Downing Street. You know, it's got so much sort of symbolism attached to it that he really wanted to eat there. So if he thought he could get away with it, they would eat at Downing Street. And by this point, they were living above or below what is now the Treasury building, above the Churchill war rooms, the bunker that's there. So she'd be cooking in the annex, as it was known, and then he'd go, no, we're going to eat at Downing Street because we really need to entertain. So she'd have to get into the sort of prime ministerial car, clutching everything, wrapped in shawls on her lap, and be driven the very short distance. But nevertheless, she's got all this food over to Downing Street to unload everything, to then reheat it in the kitchen there, to then, and sometimes of course the siren would go and they'd have to all reverse the thing, and it was mayhem, absolute mayhem. She always said it was her war work and that she was proud of it, but it certainly wasn't an easy life.
No, not at all. After the on 8th of May 1945, E-Day, Churchill paid Georgina the most enormous compliments.
Yeah, a beautiful story. She was cooking, of course, as usual, and he had gone up to the balcony to go and give the famous speech that we've all heard, with the crowds absolutely surging through to kind of listen to it. And he gave his speech, and as he turned away from the balcony and came back in again, Georgina had finally been persuaded to come up and watch this kind of moment of Churchill's triumph. And they all knew what was coming ahead could be awful, there's an election, all the rest of it, but this was the point where they really needed to be there. So she was there watching from the sidelines, and as he swung away from the balcony, he saw her, broke away from this group of all male politicians around him, and came over to her, shook her hand, and said, "I couldn't have done this without you." And then he ushered her onto the balcony to see these crowds all cheering for him. And she said that nothing could have meant more to her than to see this, his hour, from the vantage point of having been at his side. So it's an extraordinary moment, really.
And she was devastated when he was not re-elected, was she not?
Yes, I don't think she expected it at all, and she blamed it, she said, on the soldiers who didn't understand what he was doing. I mean, there was so many reasons Churchill wasn't elected. He'd become very irascible and very unreliable by the end of the war, and it was quite obvious people wanted change. The Labour Party were promising to enact the recommendations of the Beveridge Report, build homes for soldiers, and to bring in the welfare state, some of which the Tory Party were also promising. But people wanted to change. You know, Churchill, thank you, you did a really good job, but now can we please have new blood who will deliver this amazing system whereby we will all be safe for the rest of our lives. So he was deselected, and the Labour Party won the election, and Georgina spent the whole day just crying while everyone moved around, kind of sunk into gloom. And then she made honey sandwiches and went on 2 weeks holiday. But they were all unbelievably knackered, and I think one of the things that really comes across in diaries at the time, as well as Georgina's own memories, was just how unbelievably tired everybody was, just so worn out with the stress and the constant pressure of the war. It wasn't really, people celebrated victory because they wanted to let their hair down and they needed that moment of kind of absolute, oh my god, it's over. But actually, in many ways, it was more about, I just want this to be over. Who cares anymore? Just let it stop.
She didn't stop cooking for the Churchills, though, when the war ended.
She went on until 1954 and a bit beyond, actually.
Yeah. And she got on really well with Clemmy, and Clemmy continued to come and see her when she'd stopped working for them. And she was also responsible for encouraging Georgina to write her cookery book. How did all that come about?
They were really close. I think Georgina really struggled when she had to retire. By the time she retired in 54, she was very overweight. She had a lot of health problems. She had diverticulosis, which was causing her enormous issues. And so she was sort of forced into retirement, really. And then even after she retired, she kept coming back to train their cooks. So she really suffered from a total sort of disjunct. I mean, I think they all did. Churchill was in office again by this point and really shouldn't have been. And he was hanging on for dear life, despite the fact that he was clearly not up to the job anymore, and trying to be sort of persuaded, people desperately persuading him to leave. Clementine was absolutely knackered and suffering from all sorts of different things. So they were really, it was a horrible, horrible time. So she was sort of forced into retirement and really struggled to adjust. And then Clementine suggested that she should write a cookery book, and got her a publisher as well, and also corrected all the typescripts, because of course all the recipes had titles in French. And while Georgina wrote French and spoke French, she wrote it phonetically and spoke it phonetically. She'd learned from Paul, so none of the accents were there, and there were lots of misspelling. So Clementine corrected the typescript and wrote the foreword, and it was really, really popular. It did really, really well for a couple of years before, as with the case of many of these things, it sort of disappeared from public view. But they remained friends for the rest of Clementine's life, and Clementine used to rock up and visit Georgina when she was by now living in a bedsit above her daughter's garage. So they did remain, as far as sort of class and status would allow, pretty good friends, really, right up until their deaths, which were within months of each other.
She was quite an elderly lady when she died, didn't she? And Joan Bakewell had, I understand, interviewed her.
Yes, and it's online. It's only a short interview, sort of 10 minutes, but it's an absolute delight. Georgina was, I think, 95 at the time, absolutely bright as a button. And it's a lovely little interview, absolutely fantastic to watch, and to hear Georgina and her accent and the way in which she spoke and talked about her time with the Churchills.
I wonder what Georgina would have thought of our cosmopolitan cuisine now, the rise of the female chefs, the variety of products, the lack of seasonality. What would she have thought of today?
I think she'd have embraced it. I mean, the lack of seasonality wouldn't have been that new to her because of her cooking at the end of the Edwardian period, when people could get hold of anything. And I think the idea of cooking in a global way and embracing those influences is something that she did quite naturally. When you read her manuscript cookery book, there are influences from across the world in there. She was such a skilled cook and also a teacher. She taught her grandchildren to cook, and she was very, very generous with her time with the Churchills' cooks after the war as well, because she cooked in London. They had other cooks at Chartwell. So I think that idea of actually wanting to cook well and impart that love of cookery and that confidence in being able to just do it would be something that she'd probably find that she'd be presenting the Great British Bake Off.
Indeed, Prue Leith would have been out of a job. Well, sadly, we've run out of time, Annie, and there is so much more to tell. So I do thoroughly recommend you go buy this book, because I enjoyed it. It's not just the story of Georgina. There's an awful lot more besides it. So thank you for bringing to life the story of this wonderful lady. She did deserve to be remembered. Victory in the Kitchen: The Life of Churchill's Cook is available from Warwick Books. Annie's latest book, Food for Thought, is published on the 29th of October, a book of foodie writings from lavish feasts to street food. So it just remains for me to say, Annie Gray, thank you so much for joining us on Warwick Words Digital Festival.
Thank you very much for having me.